So thank you for joining us today for Perspectives on Gender and Culture, Why It's Not So Easy to Define Woman, presented by Dr. Dennis Weiss. This talk is the third in our Lenses of Gender series, and the last one will be tomorrow at noon and focus on how policy affects women. These lunchtime talks are part of the CCE's 21-22 programming series, Understanding Gender, which also includes 2 exhibitions. The first is The Glass Ceiling, curated by Ophelia Chambliss, and it's a series of paintings, stories, testimonials, and spoken and written word pieces by women that address the issues of realizing, reaching, and breaking the glass ceiling to success in their careers and personal lives. This exhibition is on view at the Center for Community Engagement in downtown York through May 31st. And the title slide here is part of the series, so you get a little sneak preview here. The second exhibition is Engendered, and that features work by artists addressing gender identity in a variety of ways that include examining their own relationship to establish gender norms and expectations, responding to the heteronormative male-female binary, and asserting queerness as a fluid alternative to the idea of a stable gender identity. This exhibition is on view at Mark View Arts through May 21st. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Weiss. He is a professor of philosophy in the Arts and Humanities Department, who is interested in the intersections of popular culture, philosophy, technology, and feminist theory. He regularly teaches courses on human nature, women, and gender studies, film, and philosophy of technology, and has a range of publications exploring technology's impact on the human condition. Thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thanks, Karen. And I'd like to thank all of you for showing up this afternoon for this lunchtime talk. I'd like to thank Cherish for reaching out and making the invitation. And of course, the CCE for organizing this week's events, which have been very worthwhile. I mentioned to Karen earlier that COVID finally caught up to me a couple of days ago. So I've been suffering through a bad cold. Hopefully I'll get through this next hour without too much sneezing or coughing or any kind of embarrassing activity. And since this is an event sponsored by the Center for Community Engagement, I want to make this talk just a tiny bit engaging if I can. So I want you all to fire up your chat box and be prepared to do a little bit of writing. Also, since it's been sponsored by the Center for Community Engagement, I figure I should kind of begin with the community. And in this particular case, I'm beginning with our own community, in which we are witnessing a Senate campaign in which a number of our candidates, including a fairly well-to-known televisual doctor, is arguing that men shouldn't play women's sports. And of course, this is a talking point in a lot of Republican candidates' platforms these days, both here in Pennsylvania and around the country. Some of you may know that the House recently passed a bill banning transgender women from competing on women's sports teams. And you may be aware of the controversy, again, in our own community here in Pennsylvania, of the swimmer Leah Thomas, who swims for the University of Pennsylvania, sanctioned by both the university and the NCAA. And yet that has become incredibly controversial, both here in Pennsylvania and around the country, to the degree that it actually showed up in the context of the Senate confirmation hearings of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson.
You provide a definition for the word woman.
Can I provide a definition?
Mm-hmm.
No,
Yeah,
I can't.
you can.
Not in
Okay.
this context.
So you
I'm not a
believe the meaning
biologist.
of the word woman is so unclear and controversial that you can't give me a definition?
Senator, in my work as a judge, what I do is I address disputes. If there's a dispute about a definition, people make arguments and I look at the
All right.
law and I decide.
Well,
so I'm not.
The fact that you can't give me a straight answer about something as fundamental as what a woman is underscores the dangers of the kind of progressive education that we are hearing about.
That was Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee questioning Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. What I'd like to ask you all to do now is to open up that chat box for a moment. And I'd like you to think about that question. How do you define woman? And without overthinking it too much, if you'd like to just leave us a quick definition in the chat box, how would you define woman? Let me give you a minute to type a thought into our chat box. That's a nice reference to Shania Twain, Amanda. Tara has an interesting definition going on there. Let me give you one more minute to see if a couple others of you want to contribute a thought. Well, thank you for those of you who posted a brief definition. Notice that we already have, Tammy, I don't know if I'm going to offer a definition or not. This is difficult territory, as we'll see. Notice we have some variety in terms of our definitions. Someone who identifies as a woman, a biological female, someone who feels like a woman, which may not necessarily be the same thing as someone who identifies as a woman, a strong person, which I think is an interesting definition and avoids any kind of question about gender or sex. So we've got a variety of definitions, and I think actually some definitions that are a little more interesting than the definitions that are offered by our own GOP senators who are posing the question. For instance, Marsha Blackburn initially says, well, a woman is someone with 2 X chromosomes, but when pressed to address questions about individuals who might have for instance, 1 X chromosome and be a woman, individuals who have something called Turner syndrome, or individuals who have Klinefelter syndrome, a genetic condition that results when a boy is born with an extra copy of an X chromosome and has 2 X chromosomes. Marsha Blackburn's definition is kind of lacking, I think. Even more problematic in this particular context is the Missouri Republican Senator Josh Hawley, who initially says, well, someone who can give birth to a child. But of course, there are lots of women who can't give birth to children, women who have had a hysterectomy, for instance, or women who are sterile. Again, he revises that to suggest, well, maybe we just mean someone who has a vagina. But we might think that some trans women have a vagina, as do some trans men. These definitions, I think, are really very specious definitions. And yet, what we see in that question from Marsha Blackburn is the way in which asking for a definition of woman, asking for a question about sex and gender immediately involves questions about politics and political ideology. And I think one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about today is the way in which gender and culture interact in sometimes very complex ways. Before getting there, though, I want to say a little bit about my own approach to some of these issues. I'm a professor of philosophy. I'm a practitioner of philosophy, I like to say. And as a practitioner of philosophy, I think we need to emphasize implies critical inquiry at the foundation of almost all of our controversial issues. Inquiry implies carefully and critically examining complex issues, asking questions about what the issue is and what kinds of claims or judgments are at issue, what reasons, what arguments are on either side of the issue. What is the context in which an issue comes up? I think that's one of the questions that Judge Ketanji Brown was kind of puzzled by. What was the context of that question? And how do we go about evaluating reasons and arguments as we begin to formulate judgments about complex issues? I think if there's one takeaway that I'd like you to take away from this talk is the importance of engaging in slow, careful, critical thinking when confronted with complex ideas and thoughts. And in this particular case, when talking about sex and gender, I think, in fact, we are confronted with some particularly difficult issues. There is an assumption out there, and I think we saw this in the previous talks in this series, that by sex we mean gender. There are two sexes, and therefore there are two genders. And we use these words, male, female, man, woman, boy, girl, masculine, feminine. We use them rather interchangeably. I can't recall the number of times in applications I've been asked to select my gender, and then it says male or female. That leads us to think that all gender is defined by biology and by male and female. It also, I think, underscores another assumption that I think has come up in almost all of the talks that have been part of this series, which is that sex and gender are dimorphic. We have a male, we have a female, we have masculine, we have feminine. In the context of philosophy, though, it's also the case that there are a lot of other dualistic categories that kind of go along with sex and gender, that nature is opposed to nurture, that biology is opposed to culture, that body and mind are opposed, emotion and reason, the private world of the home and the public world of politics, and male and female, for instance. And I think a second thing I'd like to drive home in this talk today is just how this kind of Platonic ideal of sex versus gender, male versus female, biology versus culture is probably somewhat problematic. It's problematic in part because we tend to argue on that basis that culture is created by biology, that gender is a product of sex. That is, that biology is destiny, something that is often referred to as biological determinism. Your biology determines your destiny, determines your masculinity or femininity, your gender. This is a long-standing view in Western culture. It goes all the way back to the origins of Western culture, but it's still around today. E.O. Wilson, for instance, a very famous evolutionary psychologist, argues that genes hold culture on a leash. As he suggests, the leash may be long, but inevitably values will be constrained in accordance with our genes. More recently, some of you may have been aware of the controversy in Google. James Damore, a Google engineer who published a memo arguing, as he puts it here, the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes. Damore looked around at the engineers at Google, saw that they were mostly men, and concluded that, well, they're mostly men because of their genes, because of their testosterone. Biology is destiny. And he argued that in that regard, we probably shouldn't be pursuing measures for diversity or inclusion or equity because, well, it's all kind of written in our genes. This is, as I'm sure most of you can imagine, deeply problematic. And in fact, as our speakers have suggested previously, it's problematic in a lot of ways. This is a very complicated image, a very complicated infographic, but I like it just because it's very complicated. If you look on the left-hand side of this infographic, you'll see that there are a lot of factors that determine one's sex, one's biology. Biology is not simple in this regard. You've got chromosomes, you've got gonads, you've got hormones, you've got your internal and external sex organs. You have secondary sex characteristics, and all of these things interact in very complicated ways, suggesting that there's no simple way in which we can talk about how biology determines gender. In fact, a feminist philosopher that I'm fairly fond of, Alison Stone, has argued that our thinking about sex and sex properties is inherently muddled. In fact, sex is probably a whole cluster of properties, and it's probably appropriate to say that it's a matter of degree, that whether one is male or female is itself a matter of degree. Stone observes, for instance, that these simplistic discussions of sex as male or female and as biologically determined ignore the percentage of individuals who are born intersex, a percentage which people have estimated range somewhere between 1.5 to 2 or slightly more % of the overall population. And they ignore the complex ways in which cultures organize sex, including the Native American societies in North America, many of which recognized 5 distinct gendered roles: male, female, two-spirit female, two-spirit male, and transgendered individuals. These aren't particularly new kinds of categories. They go back prior to the founding of the United States as a country. This has given rise to a lot of work in feminist philosophy, beginning especially with the French existentialist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, who argue that you're not born a woman, rather you become a woman. What de Beauvoir means by this is you're born with a female body or you're born with a male body, but those bodies don't have an innate meaning. Each of us kind of creates a body's meaning in an ongoing process. One becomes a woman or becomes a man by giving meaning to one's body over time. And that meaning is, of course, cultural. The anthropologist Gail Rubin made this claim about the nature of now what she's referring to as the sex-gender system. We're not talking about sex on the one hand, gender on the other hand. We're talking about a system, a set of social and cultural arrangements by which the biological raw material of human sex and procreation is shaped by human and social intervention. Some of you may have seen something along these lines, along the claims that Judith Butler, another well-known, highly established feminist philosopher, who argues that masculine and feminine roles are not biologically fixed, but are socially constructed. Butler speaks of babies being girled or boyed at birth. One's body never presents itself as kind of a bare biological fact. Rather, it's always a lived body, which is interpreted and which is shaped by complex cultural practices. And think of all of the ways in which young parents, for instance, new parents, remark on the gender of their children. Now it happens, of course, even before they're born, as we have gender reveal parties. It happens in terms of the toys. It happens in terms of the dress code. It happens in terms of comportment, how you learn to sit, how you learn to walk, how you learn to move your body through space. All of these things are social and cultural phenomenon individuals such as de Beauvoir and Butler want to argue. And that begins to suggest to us that this idea that sex is equal to gender and that there are two clear sexes and therefore two clear genders, that this is probably a deeply problematic picture of the complex ways in which we have to, or ought to, think about the nature of the sex-gender system. I'll give you another way in which it becomes difficult to offer up clean and simplistic definitions of what is a woman. This one comes from Sojourner Truth and her very famous speech and question, "Ain't I a woman?" Here too, I want to ask you to maybe reflect a little bit on that question coming from this freed slave, "Ain't I a woman?" and think a little bit about how does that question complicate Marsha Blackburn's question, "Can you define woman?" And what I'm going to do is play for a few minutes here a clip from Sojourner Truth's speech as interpreted by Kerry Washington. And if you want to take a minute and think about this and put a comment in our chat box, I welcome you to do so.
There is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white man gonna be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as any man when I could get it. And I could bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, seen most sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? And they talk about this thing in the head. What is it they call it? Oh, that's right, yeah, intellect. That's it, honey. Well, what's that got to do with women's rights and Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full?
I'm going to pause it there and move on. I think it's a very powerful talk. And it's a very powerful talk that asks us to think about that question, ain't I a woman? Marsha Blackburn says to the judge, can you define woman? As if there's some one essential way of defining who a woman is. And Sojourner Truth, in the context of 19th century abolitionist America, says, look, there's this definition of woman out there as someone who needs to be helped, someone who's weak, someone who has to be helped in and out of carriages, someone who doesn't labor outside the home in the fields. And yet Sojourner Truth saw herself as a woman, and yet nobody helped her. She had to labor. She was lashed when she didn't labor. She bore children who were taken from her. Sojourner Truth, I think, is raising a question of, well, maybe we have to think about how these definitions of woman can be exclusionary. Maybe we have to think about how these definitions of woman might not reflect the diversity of women's lives. And I think this is another way that we have of challenging this simplistic idea that we ought to be able to just offer up a definition of woman. If we recognize that women's lives are diverse in terms of class, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of religion, it leads us to think that there is perhaps no easy definition that we can offer of woman without thinking about some of the complexities of individual women's lives. And so we're seeing a variety of reasons why we might think that that simple-minded question, can't you define woman, is in fact a much more difficult question than our Republican senators might have assumed. Let me give you another way of thinking that this is kind of complicated. We're all kind of used to making a distinction between sex on the one hand and gender on the other. And yet implicitly that distinction can smuggle in some of the same kinds of problems that de Beauvoir and Butler and Gail Rubin were attempting to argue against. Here we have another infographic from The Lancet, a highly esteemed medical journal, this one from 2019, which suggests that sex is biological, but that gender is cultural. But in pointing out the cultural construction of gender, we have a woman who's pregnant, who's probably a nurse, who's fragile or perhaps emotional, who's entitled to care. We have a man who seems to be, well, a construction worker who takes risks and is aggressive and who has a higher workforce participation or needs financial autonomy. We recognize the distinction, a distinction which we can trace back to early feminist figures, and yet it's being used in a very questionable way. Here I want to touch on the last important point for thinking about why it's difficult to define woman. And that's a point that I think we also saw come up in our previous discussions, which is that culture is not a mere moderator of biology, but is a fully fledged cause. Here, what I want to suggest is something that a number of feminist philosophers have argued for, which is what the philosopher Alison Jagger refers to as the dialectical theory of human biology and culture. Here, for instance, Jagger points out that the biological and the social are so intertwined, both in terms of our past as well as our present, that it becomes almost impossible to distinguish between the natural and the social, the natural and the cultural, the biological and the cultural. These things are intimately intertwined. For instance, in thinking of body types, we know that there are many factors that are going to shape different bodies. We might think, well, women aren't as muscular as men. But if women don't have the same nutrition that men have, if women aren't exercising to the same degree that, or aren't given the opportunity to exercise or engage in sports to the same opportunities that men are, that's going to have an impact on body shape and body size. Jagger argues that uniformity in muscular shape, in the size and in the strength of bodies within sex categories is not caused entirely by biology. It's not caused entirely by culture either. It's caused by the complex ways in which biology and culture are intertwined. Jagger argues that this is likely true as well if we think even about the origin of the species. Jagger points out that this can be somewhat speculative, but she suggests that it's highly likely that some genetically heritable characteristics were selected in early human evolution, and that those selections had an impact on social organization, and it had an impact on male and female body size, and it had an impact on the way in which male and female societies evolved and developed. So these things go very far back in our evolution. If we think about evolution, we really do have to think about biology and culture being intertwined. In this regard, one of my favorite philosophers, someone whose work I draw on quite extensively, is a philosopher of biology, in fact, someone by the name of Marjorie Green, who spent her life studying biology and zoology from a philosophical perspective. And as she writes in one of her essays, a developed human being is at one and the same time a personalization of nature and an embodiment of culture. I'm a natural being as a human being, as an animal, but I'm a personalization of that animal being, having been raised in a culture from the moment I was born. But I'm also a body, a biological body, but a biological body that has always been part of a culture. As she continues, conversely, his or her existence as a person expresses his culture through his participation in it. Each of us, as an embodied biological being, participates in a culture. It's probably what makes us human, and it's probably what fully forms us as the biological beings that we are. As she ends, there's no separation here of two kinds. That is, you can't have sex on the one hand, gender on the other. You can't have biology determining culture as two separate things. Rather, as Green points out, these things are an inescapable ambiguity between two aspects of one reality. That ambiguity suggests that when we look at the human being, when we look at sex and gender, when we look at male and female, masculine and feminine, it's going to be a very complex story that we have to tell about the ways in which biology and culture, nature and nurture, sex and gender interact. And it's not always going to be clear what the various threads are that make up that one reality. And that should suggest to us some takeaways in thinking about sex, gender, and defining woman. That the biology of sex is much more complicated than I think is typically recognized, especially by Republican senators and people running for campaigns in the state of Pennsylvania. The relationship between sex and gender and biology and culture is dialectical. That is, it's intertwined. And it's not one way, and it's certainly not deterministic. Sex and biology, gender and culture influence and alter one another all of the time. And therefore, we have to assume, I think, that in the case of human beings, our social and cultural and biological forces are complexly entangled and sometimes very messy to distinguish. And that suggests that it's not going to be so easy to define woman or man for that case. It's going to suggest that to the question, are you a boy or a girl? There's not necessarily a simple answer. There's not a simple answer to the question, who is a woman? Or what it means to swim as herself. These are complex matters, and we should, in thinking critically about them, give due to the complexity. Thank you very much for listening to the talk. I'm going to stop sharing and invite any of you that may have some questions. Feel free if you want to unmute yourself and make a comment, ask a question, whatever you'd like to do. It's a lot of material to take in quickly. But as I suggested at the beginning, in thinking about Dr. Oz and thinking about the Pennsylvania Senate campaign and the House bill, and these are things that are coming up in our community today. I think in part that's what's motivated the CCE to engage in these activities. And so it's really important, I think, for us to kind of think about some of these issues, especially as we head into the ballot box. And I hope you all will vote in May in the primaries and in the general election in November, whatever your stance is, whatever your position is. I don't think there is a simplistic answer to any of these complex issues, but they are matters that we should think a bit about as we head into the ballot box. Thanks, Amanda. So Amanda raises a really good question. I think I'm not a prognosticator, I'm not a sociologist, but I find it interesting that a lot of these issues are coming to the fore in large part because, assuming that a lot of people in the audience right now are college students, you're younger, 18 to 22, maybe a little bit older, and you're being raised in a very different environment than even I was raised in, and certainly a different environment than, say, Dr. Oz was raised in, or Josh Hawley. And I think one of the virtues of youth is that you can question some of the assumptions of the previous generation. If you think about how that happened in the late 60s, for instance, it really resulted in a lot of significant social disruption, but also a lot of significant change. I think some of the controversy in the political sphere is being driven by the fact that younger people these days are much more comfortable with thinking about sex and gender as matters of degree, matters of fluidity, matters in some respect of choice. I don't think I would want to emphasize choice too much because certainly biology plays a part in that. We don't want to ignore that idea. But I think younger people are bringing a very different set of concepts to their thinking about the sex gender system than maybe their parents did, and surely that their grandparents did. And so it's likely that we're going to see these things change. One of the reasons feminist philosophers were quick to adopt the notion of the sex gender system is because once we recognize that gender isn't simply a product of one's biology, it suggests that we may possibly be able to change some of our ways of acting and thinking along gendered lines. I'm interested in technology. I'm interested especially in biotechnology, and I'm interested in some of the very kind of out there proposals for thinking that we might even embrace biotechnological changes that could have even more far-reaching implications for how we think about the nature of sex and gender and biology. So I think a lot of these things are up for grabs, and it wouldn't surprise me to see that we're going to see some fairly significant changes in coming generations. So it's a good question, Amanda. Any other comments or observations or questions about any of these matters?
I don't know if this is really a question or or a comment, but
Comments and observations are equally worthwhile, Rebecca.
but I think that I mean, it was interesting to point out that the definition of being a woman or being a man can be tied to class and religion or culture, and thinking about, like, I know a lot of the discussions around gender that are happening in our country, people kind of point to biology and they're like, oh, well, it's biology, male or female, but it seems like some of those like ideas may actually be coming from class or religion and the concept of gender through that. So I don't know, do you think that I don't know if that's really a question, but do you think that that's like sort of influencing how people view gender?
Absolutely. I think that's a very worthwhile observation. So if you think a little bit about how Sojourner Truth came to that issue, the definition of woman when Sojourner Truth was kind of confronting it was someone who was weak, someone who needed to be protected, someone who largely inhabited the private domestic sphere of the family. And Sojourner Truth looks at herself and she thinks, well, ain't I a woman? And she says, nobody's protecting me. I'm not residing in the private domestic space of the family. Nobody thinks that I'm weak. They've been forcing me to work since the time I was a child. And so that definition of woman was particularly shaped by the cultural context in which it was being offered. Now, a similar kind of problem emerged in early second wave liberal feminism. People like Gloria Steinem argued women need the freedom to leave the home and enter the workspace. Well, Gloria Steinem was advocating for white women to get out into the workspace and be considered equal of men in their capacity to work. A number of Black feminists were arguing, well, we women aren't at home lounging. We are already out there working, doing domestic labor. Sometimes the domestic labor that white middle-class women weren't doing themselves. And so there was something of a backlash amongst Black feminist thinkers who argued that the way in which liberal feminism itself was constructed embodied certain kinds of social and political values that suggested, again, women need X, where it was really just a certain class of women need X. I sometimes get the sense as well that when Republicans are criticizing trans women who participate in women's sports, it's because they think women need to be protected more. Women are still the weaker sex. They're still the fairer sex. We still have to watch out for them. So in all of these different ways, I think Rebecca's absolutely right that our definitions of woman or women embody certain kinds of political or social or cultural or class valences that we need to be aware of. Many feminist figures have kind of challenged the notion that we can find some kind of essential nugget of womanhood that defines all women as essentially the same. If we agree, as I think all three speakers in this series so far has suggested, that biology and culture are dialectically and complexly intertwined, it's not likely that we're going to be able to pinpoint some kind of essential nugget of womanhood. And to do so, I think, is to pursue a problematic agenda. So there are a couple other comments in the chat function. Michelle writes, a graduate student, but I'm open-minded, as we all should be. I think there are fears of removing gender, which is not valid, but I think it's out there. And I think someone like Alison Jagger, for instance, would agree. It's not a question of removing gender, nor is it a question of emphasizing biology separate from gender. It's understanding the complex ways in which, in being human, our biology is in many respects messily entangled with social, cultural, and material factors. And so I think the emphasis is simply not trying to offer simple-minded, clear, dichotomous definitions of who is a man, who is a woman, but allowing ourselves to recognize the complexity of the question and the complexity of the context in which those questions come up. I think Judge Ketanji Brown was perfectly correct in observing. You're asking me a question, can I define woman? But you're not giving me any context in which to think about that question. As a judge, I could imagine that there are certain contexts in which I have to think about that. And I can imagine that there are certain interests that I have to explore. But absent that context, absent those issues, I'm not going to be able to give you an easy definition of woman or man for that regard, or sex, or for gender, I think. These things are complicated. And I think if we want to be good practitioners of critical inquiry, we'll be aware of those complications rather than ignoring them. Kayla writes, how do you think that professionals can further help younger generations educate older generations? I've noticed students wanting change, but getting the buy-in from leadership has been a challenge. Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. As an increasingly older person, it can be challenging. Dialogue, I think, is really important. Not being judgmental or quick to judge, I think, is really important. If you go back to one of those early slides where I was talking about critical inquiry is about making reasoned judgments. And if I'm going to make a reasoned judgment, and if I'm going to do so in a way that, for instance, Michelle observes as a graduate student, I'm going to want to engage in dialogue. I'm going to want to look at the issues in a complex way. And I'm not going to want to be too quick to simply write someone up, which is not to say that that's what younger people do. It's not to say that's what older people do. It can sometimes be very difficult to sustain dialogue across different ideological or even generational divides. It's hard work. I suspect that one of the things that the CCE is interested in is, in a sense, engaging in that hard work of figuring out how to sustain dialogue across different generations, different ideological backgrounds, different cultural or social backgrounds. It's not easy. It's hard work. I take some solace from the fact that feminist philosophy, feminist theory in general, has been able to engage in that in its 30 or 40 years as being part of the academy. It has engaged in slow, careful, deliberate dialogue. It's tried to look at things from multiple perspectives, from a both and or dialectical perspective. And that's not easy, but I think it's probably essential to making progress, especially now at a time when, as a country, there seems to be so much divisiveness there. I would add my own 2 cents, and I may be totally wrong about this, and it may be very generational. I'm not sure that social media is the medium in which to have those kinds of slow, careful, deliberate dialogues. It's possible, I suspect. It's possible, but I think it's harder. Being present and embodied with the individuals that we're engaged with, I think, viscerally makes it much easier. But then I'm an older person who's new to social media. Other comments, observations, questions, soapbox moments. We've got a couple of minutes left if there are some thoughts out there. Absolutely, Amanda. It can be very difficult.
And I think, Dennis and Kayla, you hit the nail on the head in that the CCE is trying to have some of those conversations. And so, we welcome any opportunity to continue to do that. The whole reason that we are doing this series is because in higher ed, we kind of have the opportunity to see trends before they reach the greater population sometimes. And we want to provide some education on the language and the ideas and these things surrounding gender so that our community, both our campus community and the greater York community, can really better understand the attitudes of new generations. And so thank you for sharing with us today, Dennis and Kayla. We look forward to, talking with you as well. But if there aren't any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat as I'm wrapping up here. But we have one more talk tomorrow at noon. So if you aren't registered yet for that, please consider doing so and check out the exhibits at Market View Arts and at the Center for Community Engagement. And I'd like to give a huge thank you to Dennis and to Rebecca and Cherish, who helped kind of plan everything on our end. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen, and thank you all for participating this afternoon. It was a pleasure spending a lunchtime with you and talking about some important issues.